So my name's Dr. Nicole Ponsford, and I'm the founding CEO of the GEC, as well as being the co-head of education at Microlink, which means I get to, I get to straddle lots of areas when we're thinking about being underserved. And this data comes from our first report at the GEC, where we've surveyed 26,000 voices in education of staff and students. And our work uses a new form of data for inclusion, which is called kaleidoscopic data. And in this, it is a new third level of data beyond the static data that are used in MIS systems or DFE data collection. This is based on the Equality Act and on the lived experiences. And it highlights in particular our marginalised and disadvantaged voices, both in the staff room and in the classrooms. And I think it's been really interesting what you've been saying so far, Marius, looking at the data around suspensions, looking at it in terms of attendance. And I will talk to this in just a moment, but I was just having a little look at the report that we'd created, the 26,000 voices, and over a quarter of our students that identified as neurodivergent or as having a disability say that they've missed school due to feeling unsafe in school. And I think this is really where we start to see the terminology around the new Ofsted framework, which is, in their words, achieve, belong and thrive. I think that we actually need to be thinking around, is that belonging needs to be done first to unlock the potential so our young people can achieve and then go on to thrive. So just to talk to some of this data as well. So we ask our young people, they self-identify, they have anonymous surveys. There's been an awful lot of work, 5 universities, 50 student councils creating these surveys. So the young people feel that they can have a voice, which means we really do collect unique data. School leaders get this in their own context, but after a year of doing this, we wanted to put out our national information, which is where this comes from. So some of the things we learned is that, you know, 30% of SEND learners strongly disagreed that teachers listen to their perspective, and this compared with, as you can see, a huge cavum of 8.7 of non-SEND students, and that isn't just disagree, that's strongly disagree. They were very acute in the fact that they felt that their voices were not listened to, acknowledged, or even sought in a lot. And when we look at the Ofsted frameworks, gathering pupil voice is one of the key elements that's new, that qualitative data, the data for storytelling, which needs to be there. A fifth of students with identities who identify that strongly disagree that their needs are supported. And I think this is really important, because where our young people might be on waiting lists for CAMS or for neurodivergent testing, for example, for a medical diagnosis, that, you know, the young people maybe already be getting that provision in school. We know great schools and trusts that are creating really inclusive environments for our young people whilst they wait years for identification. And those young people are saying that their needs aren't supported. What did come up interestingly in this, Marius, as well, when we looked at the qualitative data and the storytelling, the young people were asking for assistive technologies. And when they had it, they had an increased sense of belonging in the classroom when they were able to use it.
Well, that's interesting in itself, isn't it? You know, yeah. Sort of where they are heard and where they have confidence that they're being heard, they will access the technology that will help them.
Well, that's it. And it helps them with that communication in a way that we've seen on our programs with Microlink on Be That Teacher and Be That TA, where young people have been sort of dismissed that they can't read, maybe they're dyslexic. And once they use assistive technology, you know, the teaching staff will say, oh, look, they can read, you know, and as I always say, we just haven't given them the right things. So it's imperative, I think, that we are asking our marginalised young people how they feel, what can we do to serve them better. We also, in our data, we saw for the students who didn't want to disclose their identities, and normally in the data they therefore get missed, but I think it's really important for the students who feel that they are still unsure about identifying to their schools about their lived experience, felt that they were heard. And when we start to roll this information out, and we think about what we're putting in front of them, for example, when we're looking at the curriculum, our data from surveying over 12,000 students of this data set here, a third of them felt invisible in the curriculum. So that's when we ask them, do you see yourself in a curriculum? Do you see members of your family represented, people like yourself in the curriculum? And when we roll that out, that equates to almost 3 million students just not seeing themselves in textbooks and in PowerPoints and examinations as well.
Oh, totally. And then there's 34% disagree that it needs a supported, 12% feel fully included. Nick, these are stunning overarching statistics. And let's be clear about the way you collected this data. Now, some schools might have a simple "Do you love school?" questionnaire that goes out, and then they'll say, "Oh, look, 90% of our children say that." But how about the children that perhaps might have felt shamed about saying they didn't feel included, and so they ticked the right box because they felt it might be the one that they had? What if they had the TA sitting next to them to help them fill in this, and therefore they felt they couldn't be honest? Your data collection mechanisms went below that, didn't it?
Yeah, well, I did this part of my doctoral research, so if anyone's ever done anything in that field, you'll know about getting things in front of an ethics committee. My methodology was not just ethical, but it was about participatory action research. So that means you co-design this with your participants. So for the student side, I was actually told, don't look at demographics and don't look at early years. So of course I did both, Marius, because I'm a bit cheeky. So we looked at, we worked with Goldsmiths University with their teacher centre, and then did an extended piece with their early years specialists, and actually worked with nurseries and schools, and brought in 50 student councils over a year to help design this. And not only did we do that in terms of what questions we should ask, the students helped, they brought in new questions. For example, one of the students in our workshop said, I feel really safe in my classroom, but if I go into the corridor, it's very crowded, it's very noisy. So we started to bring in where children and young people felt safe in the physical environment, as well as in, the tick box belonging. And the demographics were really important and age appropriate, obviously. But even in terms of looking at the digital way we collect that survey data, not just in terms of working with clinical psychologists, etc., but actually bringing in the digital rights of the child, the ICO, digital rights of a child, and bringing in things like consent. So the students have to actually press a button to say they're happy to do the survey, which might seem like a small thing, but actually, we give out surveys in school like we give out quizzes. There's not much thought. And we also developed a whole teacher's toolkit where we give the questions in advance. And we also support the schools with some of the partners like COOF, for example, to ensure that mental health provision, safeguarding is at the forefront before the students even sit in front of these. So there's a whole 360, which allows a psychologically safe space for the young people to do it, which means they give their story, which means school leaders can see this in a new way that they haven't before.
This is fascinating, because for me, to even ask the questions the way you have phrased it in this whole co-construction journey means that a school has got to be committed to that before they can even engage in this type of questioning.
Yeah, and that's what we're finding as well. The school and trust leaders who are looking to do this ethically, not just in terms of an EdTech tool, but as a whole organisational change piece, and to really, uncover yes, the gaps in their knowledge and what they don't know, but also to see maybe where they're doing it right, because that's the other avenue with this. Our data also illustrates things that are working well as well, and where those lessons can be learned. Boys, for example, in the data had an increased sense of belonging to girls, and we've seen that with the exams. The gender gap is closed much more in the summer exams and assessments than they have done before. We are getting some of the things right, but if we don't collect the right data, we're missing things out. So, for example, there are certain religious groups that we could identify that actually were having a harder time, that might slip through data buckets that we get traditionally. So, yes, for me, data for inclusion needs to be as multidimensional and fluid, as our young people and staff that we've got. And I think really at this point where we've got a backdrop of incredible technology and big data, it's really about having smarter data for school leaders rather than more data.
And I also think it's not being seduced by the big number. 90% of our children say they feel a sense of belonging in the school. The wise leader will then say, what about the 10%? Correct?
Yes. And who are they? Who is saying this? And what do they mean? So again, having qualitative and quantitative data, having not just the what and the numbers, but actually having the stories. What does that look like? Do they have friends they can talk to? Who is their trusted adult in the school? Have they missed school because of who they are? All of the whys that actually, make up why we go onto a physical site every day, and the company we run alongside with.
And it's the same in politics, right? So, when you say, we got 67% of the vote, we got 70% of the vote. Isn't that wonderful? Hang on, but only 30% of the population voted.
Yeah.
So if you're saying 90% of my population is absolutely pleased with the school, is that really 90%, or was it 90% of the people who participated?
That's it. And there's a difference between, and I think this is what we'll start to see, particularly with the Ofsted framework and the criteria on inclusion, those that are doing this in a tokenistic way, and those who are actually really intentional about inclusion as well. The change, I think, from looking at it is very much about leaderships and how they drive this, and very much how they evidence it. The evidence is going to be the key part of it. And there are ways, as we're illustrating, that this can be done, and not only that it can be achieved, but actually, working within the system and working with participants to do this. So inclusion is threaded not just into the outcomes, but the methodology of how we do this too.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Microlink Education, home of the Neuro Inclusive Classroom.